Welcome to the Scaling Japan podcast, a podcast about how to grow your business from $100,000 and beyond in the land of the rising sun.
Welcome to the Scaling Japan podcast. I am your host, Tyson Batino, and on today's episode, we have Rochelle Kopp. She is the founder and managing principal at Japan Intercultural Consulting, which helps organizations perform better through cross-cultural training, executive and team building, coaching, HR consulting, and more. She also serves as an independent board director at MS&AD Insurance Group and Lightworks Corporation. She is a renowned expert on Japanese business culture and HR management. We did our first episode on Japanese business culture, and on today's episode, we're going to focus on Japanese business manners and why it's important. And Rochelle, glad to have you again for the second episode. And could you give a quick introduction, please?
Oh, certainly. So I spend a lot of time talking with people about Japanese business manners because I do a lot of consulting work with people from outside of Japan who want to improve their interactions with Japanese colleagues, and do a lot of work with foreign firms that have operations in Japan or that are working with Japanese customers, partners, and suppliers. Also do a lot of work with Japanese global organizations that have non-Japanese that work in their global operations who would be visiting Japan and interacting with people from Japan.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of takeaways in this episode. Even for people who've been in Japan for 5, 10, 15 years, I think there'll be a couple nuggets in here for you long-timers as well.
I'll do my best to do that.
Many foreigners, myself included, sometimes we believe that we can, or in some cases it's true, but we can get away with things in Japan because we're not Japanese. But why has understanding Japanese business manners benefited you and your clients?
Well, I think the key thing about Japanese business manners is it's part of, in Japanese culture, there's a belief that things need to be done in a certain way and be done properly. If you can show that you understand and are following business manners, it shows that you are making an effort to understand the way things are expected to be done in Japan. And so it becomes a signal, in a sense, that, hey, I understand that there's a certain way of doing things and I'm making an effort to do that. And for Japanese, that will be viewed as carrying over to other things that you do, including the quality of your work and the quality of your work interactions. So it's basically a way of showing people, hey, I want to make an effort to do things in a way that you are going to be comfortable with, even if it's not how I always do things.
Probably one big advantage of that too possibly could be, even if maybe your presentation or like you didn't have the best offer or maybe you didn't have the flashiest presentation, the fact that you understand Japanese culture could probably create a lot of trust, right?
Yes, definitely get extra points for that. And it's something very important. And so, yeah, you could have the person who has, the flashiest presentation. And actually, I don't think Japanese always like flash, but that's another story. But anyways, somehow I just feel comfortable with this person. That is going to make a huge difference for people and could weigh more than other factors.
Cool. And I think one term that maybe you could explain before we jump in is KY or Kuuki yomeru.
Oh, yes. KY is Kuuki yomenai. And so it's people who can't yomo the Kuuki, right? So what this is it's literally translated as whether or not you have the ability to, quote unquote, read the air. So for Japanese, they have a lot of communication that is nonverbal. There's a lot of reading between the lines or reading in the air, so to speak. And so your ability to pick up on those subtle signals and to be interacting in the way that's appropriate for that particular time and setting and atmosphere is a real mark of how effective you are as a person in business or whatever setting it is. And so Japanese dub people who aren't good at reading the air as Kuuki yomenai. They can't read the air. And so that's a really bad thing to be. And so one thing you can do by understanding, the manners and traditions is to be showing that you can read the air.
And if they say you can read like Kuuki yomeru, that is a big compliment, especially for a foreigner.
Yes. So if you're able to read the air, that's a big deal. Yes.
Gotcha. And I'm not sure if I'll go so far as to say it's kind of like the saying, like, this person has common sense.
Well, it would be common sense in the Japanese context. I always want to be really careful with that word common sense, because common sense is not the same thing in every culture. And one way to describe different cultures is that there are different views of common sense. It would be show that you understand what Japanese common sense is.
And yes, I guess one question that foreigners would like to know is, what are some business manners that you definitely cannot get away with in Japan?
Well, this is just the first thing that comes to mind, and you don't want to blow your nose in front of Japanese. And that is really considered very, very uncouth. And so I think that a lot of times people from other countries will just, I need to blow my nose, I'm going to blow my nose now. And for Japanese, that's just awful. You would need to leave the room to do that. So that would just be a small thing. I think that, in general, forgetting to say thank you is a really bad thing to do in Japanese culture. That saying thanks is really important. And so acknowledging those things that other people have done for you and doing that in a very clear way is very, very important. And you'll see even in business correspondence, typically you'll thank people for the last nice thing they did for you. And so, I'll just give you an example where I flubbed my business manners the other day. I had a meeting in the morning with one of my colleagues, Keiko, with a potential client. And then later in the day, I was emailing Keiko about something, and I just kind of went directly into whatever I was talking about. And in her response, it was real. I forgot exactly what she said, but it was really clear that she was sort of taken aback that I hadn't started with thanks for the meeting this morning, or thanks for getting up so early to get to this meeting, or I should have acknowledged her efforts that morning before I jumped into other work things. And I was in a hurry and I forgot to do that. And it was really clear that it was just like, wow, Rochelle, that was rude, So that would just be an example where you need to say thank you again, perhaps more than we would. In the United States, the thanks at the end of the meeting would be enough and we wouldn't talk about it again. But for Japanese, at the next interaction, you always want to refer back to the last interaction.
I think that also relates to in Japan as well, like how important it is to do the greetings.
Greetings are very, very important. And if you walk into an office or an area and you don't properly greet people, then you're rude and you're cold, and so it's something that, gets drummed into Japanese. It starts when they're younger, when they're in school, and it's considered to be just a big part of public life. And one thing that just comes to mind when I think about this is that for several years, every summer I taught a course at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Beppu. I would go there for a week in August and do an intensive course for the MBAs. And I would stay in this little charming village. The person who originally invited me to speak there or teach there, sort of showed me this little village, and I would, in the middle of nowhere, but it wasn't really that far from campus. And I would just enjoy being in this just delightful, picture perfect little place. It was charming. And one thing that they had was around the village, little signs, exhortations for, different things that were important for your life, pick up the garbage or whatever. And this is a very common thing to have in Japan. You see all these kind of signs all over exhorting you to do this thing or that thing. But this was, even in this little town, they had it. And one of the signs was, greet people cheerfully. So this was an important enough thing that they put it on a sign to emphasize that they should all be greeting everyone else cheerfully in town.
And the experience of why greetings are so important came to light for me when many, many years ago, I worked for a year in a junior high school as an English teacher.
Uh-huh.
And the students had to greet the teacher like "Ohayo gozaimasu." And if they didn't greet the teacher, if the teacher walked by in the hallway, they would get chewed out.
Oh, yeah, that was a big thing. Well, you know what that makes me think of? When I was in college, I did an internship at a Japanese savings and loan. And for 2 weeks of the internship, they sent me to work in the branch. And so it's an open area. So in front, there's the tellers and, the customers who come work with the tellers. And behind are rows of desks of people doing all their paperwork. And so I was sitting with them. There's no back office. Everyone who works in the branch is out there. The branch is just one giant room. And one thing you had to do is whenever someone entered the bank, everyone who worked there had to say "irashaimase." So if someone were coming in to go talk to the teller, you would have 25 people probably who worked there in unison would say "irashaimase." And then when they were done with their business and they were leaving, everyone in the branch would say "arigatou gozaimashita," or well, thank you. Being typical American, I would not remember to do this. And I'd be wrapped up in whatever little busy work task they gave me. And I get an elbow in the ribs. Time to say "irashaimase." You have to say it too. And I would always forget. So kind of being part of that communal aisatsu, greeting was something that just wasn't instinctual for me.
So at One Coin English, we actually are pretty strict on the Japanese staff too about saying greetings when students enter the door. And I think we actually got a negative review in one case where the Japanese staff member didn't do it.
Oh, why was I not greeted properly?
And
that would be rude. It would be rude because it would not be acknowledging that person as someone worthy of respect.
I think we've given a lot of examples on just this one point, but I think you can finally get how important doing a greeting is now.
People really, really care about it. Yes, that's true.
And do you have any frameworks you use to help yourself or your clients understand Japanese manners or any kind of rules of thumbs?
The main rule of thumb I tell people is to watch what people around you are doing. Generally, if it were going to be rude in your culture, it's probably going to be rude in Japanese culture too.
And
the other thing I like to say in general, I don't know if it's so much for manners specifically, but I think it's important, is I always tell people talk less and listen more.
Excellent. And with your example of follow Japanese, my experience has been if you ask a Japanese person why, usually they're pretty happy to explain to you. And I want to ask you, for specific situations, what could a person do in these situations?
Okay.
But I know that seating situations is really important.
Yes.
But what are kind of situations that you might find yourself in, and what do you do in each case?
Okay, well, specifically for seating, again, the key thing is go to where they want you to sit. So they'll have a certain idea of where they think it's appropriate for you to be sitting, and you should just go there. So often I will kind of stand and wait for them to tell me. And as a general rule, you can kind of figure out that usually you'll sit away from the door on the farthest side of the room. If there's a piece of artwork or a window, you would sit with that behind you. And you would have the most senior person be in the middle of the table with less senior people flanking them if there's more than one of you. But I just had a meeting the other day and I sort of automatically walked over to what I thought was the appropriate seat and had the window behind me. And they're like, no, we want you to be on this side. I'm like, okay, whatever you say. So I did have many, many years ago, I have one of my American colleagues, a fellow consultant from my firm, and she had just recently joined my firm, and we went to go meet with a client, and she sat herself down in a certain spot. And I'm like, Susan, you shouldn't sit there. And she's like, but I want to sit here. I'm like, but it's important where you sit, and they may not want you to sit there. And she had a lot of trouble. I mean, she didn't have any Japanese culture background. She was on our team because she's an HR expert, and she just had a lot of trouble understanding why it mattered. And it was difficult for me to understand it. I'm like, well, it just is important because it's kind of a place for everything and everything in its place. And you've got to be in your right place.
Yeah, you want to start the meeting on a high note. Don't take their preferred seat.
Right. Don't distract with something unnecessary. Well, I think that's a good way to think about Japanese manners, that if everyone follows the rules, everyone does what they're expected to do, then you reduce distractions.
One of the common challenges I see with my consulting clients is not having any staff internally who can drive marketing strategy and execution to the next level. This really limits the growth trajectory of a company, especially for a leader like you that wants to go from 30 million to 500 million yen a year and does not have the time to spend years learning through trial and error. To solve this problem, I'm launching a marketing agency that can help companies like yours to increase leads and closing rates through SEO, Google Maps, content marketing, and websites that convert. Head over to scalingyourcompany.com and book a free consultation. Let's talk about what your business needs are, where your current strategy is letting you down, and how we can help you see real results with the methods I've successfully implemented at multiple companies myself. Now, back to the episode.
However, if you're doing something that doesn't fit, that becomes a distraction. And I think Japanese, a lot of what they do is, I don't want to do anything that becomes a distraction. And so you see that, for example, I'm often very interested in like the clothes that Japanese businesswomen wear, because I'm always looking to see what's considered appropriate, et cetera. And, I noticed like Japanese businesswomen never wear patterns. Like, as you can see from me here in like my last video, I tend to like patterns and I think they look good on video, but I like to have a pattern in what I'm wearing. And I have to get shirts with patterns in the United States. The Japanese women always are, in business contexts, are wearing a very plain, simple color. And it's a gray or black or navy or tan suit. Those are like the colors in most cases. And the shirt is almost always white or cream, or maybe black. And that's it. There's not really a lot of other options, so that their clothing will not call attention to them, let's say, which is different, I think, than how we think about clothing in the United States, because we think of clothing to show our individuality.
No, that's really interesting and I think very useful. And how about nomikai or drinking event situations?
Okay, so that is something that I think a lot of people who are from other countries where there isn't as much drinking in the business context are often surprised by how much drinking happens in Japanese business culture. And one question I get is, do I need to be drinking in these situations? And my answer is that, you don't have to be drinking. And the older I get, the less I tolerate my alcohol, so I drink very, very little anymore. And that's not a problem when I'm with Japanese colleagues. I find that sometimes they'll be like, well, if you're not drinking, is it okay for us to drink? I'm like, yeah, you guys go ahead. I don't mind. Have your beers. I'm just going to have water here. Thanks. So I think sometimes they feel like, well, maybe they're being rude if you're not drinking and they drink. And so maybe you have to reassure them. Sometimes you will get a question about it. Particularly men are more likely to be questioned than women. There's a lot of Japanese women who don't drink at all. And so I think it's sort of more usual that a woman might not drink. But I think for men, if you're not going to drink, you probably will be asked why. And that's something that would be really quite taboo in American culture. And so you need to be ready with an explanation. And, it makes my jet lag worse, or, it's not good for my health. And actually you'll hear Japanese say, they'll say, oh, I'm not drinking tonight. I have Dr. Stop. And Dr. Stop is a noun in Japanese, using those English words in their own combination. And it means my doctor told me to stop drinking. Gotcha, either temporarily or permanently. And so people will say, hey, I'm not drinking because my doctor told me not to. And, that, again, is personal information we probably would not reveal in U.S. culture. But in Japan, that's completely normal. Or you could say it's my religion. My religion says I can't drink, and I think people will be curious And so you need to be prepared for that. Don't take it as pressure. But you could give whatever reason, it clashes with my medication or whatever. Again, we wouldn't need to do that in the US, but you will be asked. So don't feel like you have to drink. If you are drinking, be aware that basically you have an infinitely refillable glass, because whenever you drink and there is room in your glass, out of kindness or politeness, you will have drink poured for you. So if you aren't careful, you could just drink way, way more than you realize. So what I would recommend is if you've had enough, leave your glass full, and so people won't give you any more. I also recommend that you also ask for a glass of water. It won't come automatically. A lot of times in the US, everyone gets a glass of water. They don't do that in Japan. So if you want water also, you can ask for it. And I would then alternate your alcohol and your water so you don't get oversaturated. With the pouring, if you can then pour for others, that is a very polite gesture and helps with the bonding. So I would recommend doing that if you can.
And if you pour for others, you can pour less for yourself.
Sometimes you can do that. And the thing is, this isn't just with alcohol, but it's with like tea, for example. So if I'm out with like one of my Japanese girlfriends and there's like a pot of tea on the table, if I want more, before I take more for myself, I pour some for her and then I pour some for me.
And recently I've noticed there's a drink called beery, which is 0.5%. And I've seen it in many, many places. And I actually asked, like, why do you guys have this? And they're telling me that there's a lot of business people, they feel like they have to drink, but they don't want to get drunk. So they actually invented a 0.5% beer, and it was a major hit called beer.
Interesting, because it hit people like, oh, you want to have the feeling of drinking a beer without the effects of drinking a beer.
Exactly.
But that's so interesting. But there's also non-alcoholic beers.
Yes.
So it's interesting that the slightly alcoholic might be more popular than the zero alcoholic.
Yeah, with the zero alcoholic, I've tried it where I would say it's better than drinking like maybe tea or water. Like people are like, cool. I would say like, I have a sports event tomorrow, but I do want to drink with everyone.
Uh-huh.
So that's why I'm drinking alcohol. And it was kind of okay, but I think the beery would go, because the beery, I think it's not really normal to pour someone's non-alcoholic beer.
Yeah.
But it would be kind of normal to even pour the 0.5%.
Right. The low alcohol you would share with other people, whereas the non-alcoholic would just be for the person not drinking. Yeah, because it could be a group thing. That is so interesting. I had not heard about that.
And so I think the next section is, I think this will be a really important one, but I'm going to bring up maybe several types of common claims and how can a person handle it in Japan. So I guess the first claim that we'll try is you delivered the wrong product or a faulty product to a client.
Japanese will use this word claim, and it means more like we would say complaint. And I would say in general, the first thing to remember with any kind of complaint, anytime that you have screwed up, or even if you didn't screw up, if you're perceived to have screwed up or if someone is unhappy, the first thing you have to do is apologize. Don't try and explain the problem away or blame someone else or, oh, it was such and such that happened. No one wants to hear that. They just want to hear, I'm really sorry. I feel badly that you were inconvenienced. Sorry that this happened. You have to be really clear about your apology and sincere about it. The other thing that people want to hear is, obviously, how are you going to fix the problem? But also they want to hear, what are you going to do to make sure this problem doesn't happen again? They want to hear your plan. And if they don't hear that, then they're going to think, well, you're just not really dealing with real issues, and I can't think of you as a reliable person to work with.
Maybe the next situation would be you have to go over budget, and maybe you might need some extra payment.
That's a tricky one. It's,
Yes.
Scope creep is a problem everywhere. And I find it's a particularly big problem when working with Japanese customers. So you want to be communicating. And what I would say is if you need to have that kind of conversation, you want to have it as early as possible. Before you go over, not after. and as far as in ahead of time as possible. You want to explain, here is what we originally agreed to. Here are these new things that have come up, your new requests or new issues. And so here's what we think is going to happen, how much extra we're going to have to do beyond what was originally budgeted, and here's how much it will cost. And so I think you want to have that communication as early as possible, because it's likely that they'll have to go through some hoops to approve things. It's also possible that they won't be able to get any more budget. And so then you have to think about, well, is there something that can be cut? Or maybe we won't do this thing. Or actually, a lot of Japanese suppliers will just suck it up and do it anyways. And is that a choice you want to make?
It is a tough question. I guess my last one would be, I think it's probably similar to the first one, but you're going to be late on the deliverables.
Oh, so this is another one where you need to tell them as early as possible that this might happen. Japanese hate surprises, and they really don't want to have the due date come and have you say, oh, it's not ready yet. And in fact, when I do seminars for Japanese, this is one of the things that they complain about the most, that people from other countries do not keep to deadline schedules, drives them absolutely crazy. So you want to be really careful about not having that happen. And so that means having a really early conversation and being really honest and saying, here's what's happening. Here's what might delay us. Here's how long we think it would be delayed. If there's anything that the client can do to help you not have it be delayed, ask them to do it. But heads up as early as possible, again, is very important.
Maybe one thing that maybe foreigners may not understand, or maybe newer foreigners, is they might be dealing with a different customer as well. And so they have to communicate to that person.
That customer, or it may be different parts of the company. And, I think you want to think a little bit about this idea of a deadline that I think, and I'm just using the US for reference because it's my home country, but we tend to think of deadlines as a noble goal, but then can flex as needed if necessary. Japanese think of deadlines as absolutely set in stone, and you will do anything possible to meet it, and you will absolutely meet it. And so then they get everything in line with their scheduling and planning based on that schedule. So if they don't have that product at the time that they're expecting it, it's like a set of dominoes and everything gets messed up.
Cool. No, thanks for going into detail for that. And I guess, one example is just look at the train.
Yes, Japanese train companies have to apologize if they're more than a minute late.
If you are going to be late and you claim the train, you do need the train pass or the train slip.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So they will give you a slip that tells you the train was late, so you can take it to your boss and prove that the train was actually late. Yes.
And are there any other types of claims that you help foreigners with that happen pretty often?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a claim, but one thing that comes up a lot when you're working with Japanese is that you will submit a work product and you think you're done, and they want you to make adjustments. And sometimes there's multiple rounds of adjustments. And this tends to really bother people from other countries who think, well, I finished it and it's done and I gave you the perfect thing. And Japanese will look at what you turned in as a starting point for interaction together. So it's a very different idea about what turning something in means. And so I think it's just important to be prepared for that.
And I attended your cross-cultural communication training class. And when I heard it, I was like, I definitely got to get Rochelle to talk about this. But what are some tips for, I guess, foreigners to better communicate with Japanese people in English?
Well, what I would say is that you want to be remembering that most Japanese, their English is based on learning it from a textbook. They don't necessarily have a lot of experience with actual informal communications in English. And so if you're talking about speaking, they may not be used to listening to more rapid English or English that has more slang and idioms. And so if you want to think, how can I speak English in a way that's easy to understand for someone who just has learned from a textbook? And so that means speaking more slowly, avoiding big complicated words, avoiding complicated grammar, avoiding slang, avoiding idioms. And slowing down.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Scaling Japan. In addition to serving as your fine host, I also provide advisory and coaching services to business owners who want to 2x, 5x, and even 10x their business. So stop holding your company and your team and your employees back, and let me help you and your company scale. Find more information at scalingyourcompany.com. Now back to the episode. And it might serve as a good barometer, but I often get complimented by Japanese for how easy my English is to understand. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the benefit of maybe coming from a tropical island. We normally speak sometimes, or at least people in Hawaii, we normally speak slower. So if you want something to gauge the speed at which I speak, normally Japanese really like that speed, and also like I enunciate each word. So
that's important. That's really important, actually. I think what's hard for Japanese is people from the East Coast, like the New York, New Jersey area. People talk very quickly there, and that's very difficult for Japanese to deal with.
And what are some common Japanese communication styles?
Well, I think in general with Japanese communication, they're going to be a lot less direct. And they also tend to not be as specific about things. Again, we talked about that read between the lines. That happens with a lot of communication. So a lot of times people from other countries will have a lot of trouble figuring out, well, what is it they're really trying to say? Because they're kind of brief and they're maybe kind of cryptic and not explaining things clearly because they're maybe trying to be polite or not hurt someone's feelings. And so I think that that's a communication style that people find really challenging.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a common topic you have to coach managers on. And do you have any hacks or tips on how to read the air faster in Japan?
Well, I would pay attention to nonverbal behaviors. The Japanese actually do communicate extensively through nonverbals, but you have to pay attention to catch it. So that's tone of voice, that's facial expressions, that's posture and gestures. You want to be paying a lot more attention to those things than you might in your own culture.
So for some gestures, are there any differences in gestures made?
Well, I think there's a few gestures that Japanese will do. And so if something's not good, they'll hold up their hands to be an X. For example, Americans point to their chest to say me. Japanese will point to their nose. There's also the gestures that Japanese make when they're not happy about something. So if you share with Japanese a proposal or idea and they don't like it, they'll often kind of rub their head or kind of shake their head or kind of, like, oh, this is going to give me a headache kind of thing. So that's a gesture. And I don't know if you can call it a gesture or a noise, but again, when Japanese have a idea that they don't like, they'll suck in air through their teeth going like that. And that means I don't want to touch that with the 10-foot pole. Don't make me deal with that, please.
That's a new one for me. That's awesome. And what are some additional do's and don'ts for communication?
For your written communication, write down what you want to say and then go back and think, is this easy to understand? Is there any way that I could make this simpler? Not have long run-on sentences? Can I not have, a lot of slang in there? Have I actually just even proofread it? Because if you have mistakes, that's going to really trip people up. I'd say also to have your communication be as visual as possible. Charts, graphs, illustrations, breaking up big paragraphs of text to have bullet points, more section headings, highlighting, etc.
And do you have any tips to communicate with Japanese people in Japanese in business?
Well, I think if you're someone who doesn't speak Japanese fluently, I still think it's good to learn some words. So if you can learn how to say thank you, or the word dozo in Japanese, it means go ahead. That was one that works very well. Or sumimasen, which is what you might say to like signal to a waiter or waitress in a restaurant. It's also what you might say if you've made a mistake. So some of those basic greetings, if you use them, it shows that you are making an effort and people will really appreciate it.
And another question, I think there's no perfect answer to this one, but what are some ways that Japanese people say no without saying no directly?
There's a famous article that was written about this decades ago, the 16 ways the Japanese say no, and none of them were no. And they will not answer. They will give a vague answer like, we'll consider this carefully, or we're going to think about it. They will change the subject to something else. So there's lots of ways that they can say no, sort of a faint enthusiasm, like, oh, that's interesting. So there's a lot of different ways that they could say no, and it's almost never an explicit no.
There seems to actually be a book called 16 Ways to Avoid Saying No.
I think that article turned into a book. Yeah, it's famous, yes. One of the ones in that book is like, it's raining. And I remember hearing that. I'm like, okay, how can that be an answer? And I remember one time I went with a Japanese friend. We were out sightseeing or whatever we were going to do. And she said, oh, before we start off, I need to just stop by the store. I needed to return the sweater I bought. I decided I didn't want it. Or I think she didn't even tell me why but she just said, we're going to go return the sweater. And so we go to the store and she, hands over the sweater and the person says, well, why do you want to return it? And my friend said, oh, well, it was raining. I'm like, wait, that's straight out of that book. That was her answer, and it was accepted. Wow, that's interesting.
That is really funny.
So it does actually happen. I witnessed it.
It's like using whatever at your disposal.
Well, whatever, excuse. Yeah. Well, the thing that's so interesting is that same friend, she was like a part-time worker. In Japanese, we call it part-time, but we could say it was like a contract worker. Had a non-permanent position at the bank that I worked at years ago. And she decided to quit. And so she told my boss, oh, I'm getting married. Well, she wasn't getting married. But that was just an easy excuse for I'm leaving, and you don't have to worry about why and get into details. Like, oh, it was just like in Japanese, you say tatemai. So it's like the thing you say that's not really true, but no one will argue with it. And so at the time in particular, like leaving to get married was the normal thing. So she just said, oh, I'm getting married.
And that would just, avoid any potential future conflict or having to dive deeper.
You don't have to talk about why exactly we're leaving.
Yeah, I think you phrased it very well. Or are you saying something where it's socially acceptable?
Yes.
And questions won't be asked.
Right.
Excellent. Then do you have any final tips on improving our cross-cultural communication or manners?
Well, I guess I want to just go back to one of the things I said earlier, because I think it's so important. To talk less, listen more is really key. And, I'm from a culture that is all about expressing yourself. And we kind of really love to hear ourselves talk. And if you are talking too much, you're not leaving room for Japanese to express themselves. Again, Japanese tend to be less expressive. They say less. They're less direct. So you really want to hear them to understand what they're saying. And so sometimes you have to just say less to give them space to say more, and for you to really listen to what it is that they tell you.
Let's say the US, silent moments are considered as awkward moments.
Yes.
What are some differences maybe in interpretations of seconds but silent moments?
Japanese, they do not consider silence to be negative. And in fact, just to the point for someone in the US where it's just uncomfortable that it's silent for so long, that tends to be when Japanese feel comfortable and they say something. So you want to let those silences linger longer than your gut tells you should.
And smile.
Yes, and
Well, at
smile
it.
is good.
Yeah, my last question is, do you have any seminars or so someone who would like to get more cross-cultural training or manual training from you, how could they go about doing that?
So our firm does do open seminars periodically. And right now, we have ones in the US time zone that are scheduled for September that we're kind of taking summer off. Also, we work individually with clients or with companies. And we also have e-learnings. So if you go on our website, there's an e-learning tab. And we have a Japanese business toolkit that covers a lot of the basics. And there's also a Japanese cultural values one as well.
Yeah, I think the courses were affordable as well.
Yeah, we've tried to make them affordable.
Yeah, definitely compared to getting it in live, it can get pretty pricey. So I think it's a really good, affordable option for those out there interested in learning more about Japanese culture and cross-cultural communication. Do you have any other asks or where people could find more about you?
So I do a lot of social media. So I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter. Twitter, Japan Intercult in English. I also have a Japanese one, JIC Rochelle. Also, there's books. I really need to do a new version of it, but the thing is, it's old, but it hasn't really changed that much. My first book, The Rice Paper Ceiling. Also, I have a book called The Lowdown on Japanese etiquette. It's part of a series called The Lowdown, and there's one for China, one for Russia, etc. Myself and my colleague Panilla did the Japan version, and it's available as a Kindle book. It's also available as an audio book read by a professional narrator. And that's a great one to get your basics in a really compact form.
Excellent. So we'll add links to Japan Intercultural Consulting, Twitter, the Rice Paper Ceiling, and also the Lowdown on Japanese etiquette. And thank you so much, Rochelle.
Thank you.
And I look forward to episode 3 together.